as part of God's economic policy speech, and it seems like we just can't get enough of it. It's funny when you start to look at it, you realize Jesus talked an awful lot about money. And we in our churches are often a little bit uncomfortable talking about money. So we'll see if we can get through this. The first question I think we need to ask about this parable is, how did the rich man get rich? Because when we read this, at first blush, it's very confusing. Because Jesus seems to be suggesting that this manager who cheated his boss did a good thing. And I'm fairly certain anyone who is a manager or has a boss or is a boss or has a manager would say, no, it is not good to cheat your boss. But how? How did the rich man get rich? Well, it doesn't tell us in the parable, but what we need to consider is the fact that at this time, when Jesus was telling this story, all of the disciples and the others who may have heard would have understood the situation of the day. You do not get rich without taking advantage of someone else. There is no way to accumulate the mass of wealth that he apparently has based on the debts that people have from him. There's no way to get that much wealth without having taken advantage of somebody else, without buying up land that other people could have owned but could no longer afford to own on their own, without buying up slaves and owning other people. So this rich man did not perhaps have the most righteous wealth or the most sort of savory business, as most people who had a lot of wealth and property at that time did not. And then we get to the bills, the debts. It seems at first like he is saying, you know, you may have paid $10, but I'm going to say you only have to pay back. Or you may have borrowed $10, but you only have to pay back $5. But another thing that people at that time understood was that there was a way of getting around the laws of the time, the laws against charging interest, by simply creating a larger balance to begin with. So no matter what you borrowed, your balance on your bill would be larger to account for interest that they didn't want to show they were charging. It's sort of like if you go to, remember I used to work in a coffee shop, and we adjusted all of our prices so that we could charge somebody $2 for a latte or something, but that included the tax. So the price on their bill was $2, but it included other fees that we sort of hid to make it look, now this is not unsavory, this was just easier, to make it look like it was an even $2, because if we charged them $2, and then we'd have to charge tax, and then it would be $2.14 at the time, I think. So, awkward. So, we are familiar with a process sort of like this, where the tax is included in the price. So, what this gentleman was doing is a little bit less on the up and up. Your interest is included in your principal. So you borrow something, and suddenly what you borrowed has been increased by some percentage. And when we look at the parable, we don't know these things. And I think it's important to know these things because it doesn't necessarily make the parable easier, but it puts it in context. And it's an important context to consider when we consider what it is Jesus is actually saying here. I would suggest that the rich man in this parable is the sort of fellow against whom Amos was speaking in our first reading. Hear this, you that trample on the needy, and bring ruin to the poor of the land, saying, oh, when will the new moon be over, so we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, so we may offer wheat for sale? We'll make the ephah small and the shekel great, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of these deeds. talking about. And so I think we need to try and move past that initial impulse that we have to think that the steward, the manager, was an inherently bad guy because he didn't do his job the way his master wanted him to. I think we need to move into a sort of uncomfortable place of considering that maybe it is possible to do your job poorly and still be acting righteously. It is possible to do your job poorly and still be acting righteously because perhaps what your master has asked you to do is not in accordance with what God has called you to do. And I wonder if perhaps this guy has been doing this for a little bit of time. Because at the beginning we hear that charges were brought against the manager, that he was squandering the owner's property. So the word in Greek for squandering is the same as the word for scattering. It's the same root that's used for the diaspora, the scattering of the Jewish people. So he was scattering this guy's property. What does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean he was spending it all on himself. It doesn't mean he was hoarding the profits that should have gone to his master. It could mean that he was engaging in this practice of reducing debts and therefore scattering his master's opportunities to make even more money. And another interesting note about these charges that were brought against him is that the word used for the accusations is the same word that sounds a little bit like diabolos. It's the accuser, or often the false accuser. It is possible that he was brought up on false charges. So we don't really know, but this guy has suddenly become a much more complex character. And what we see him doing then is not as easy as saying he didn't do his job, he deserves to get fired. And he's a bad guy. It's just not that easy. He didn't do his job. And maybe he does deserve to get fired because he's not doing what he was hired to do, but I don't think he's a bad guy for it. I think there are times in our lives, perhaps not as drastic as putting your livelihood on the line, but there are times when the world asks us to do something, and God is calling us to do something a little bit different. In most parables, we ask, okay, who's God in this parable? Which of the characters is God? I don't think God is in this parable. I think these are all just folks. We have a dishonest master. He certainly cannot be God. God is not a dishonest master. We have a poorly performing employee who does do good things, but is, also a victim caught up in this system of corruption. That is not God. God is not caught up in a system of corruption. And then we have a bunch of folks down at the bottom who owe an awful lot, possibly more than they can afford to ever repay. And that is certainly not God. God owes us nothing, but has given us everything. So here we have a story of the way the world works. We have a story of the way we, perhaps, as stewards of God's resources, are called to act when we are called to be stewards of the world's resources. And I think what we see is valuing a wealth of relationships over a wealth of property or stuff. In exchange for reducing these debts, the steward is granted a place to stay. He is granted relationship with people. Out of their gratitude, they welcome him into their lives. And this is what God is calling us to do, with whatever means we have, to reach out to others with our goods, or our wealth, or our position. God is calling us to use those things that we have that could be an advantage over others to instead serve others. You cannot serve God and wealth, but you can use your wealth to serve God. This is, across the board, in every commentary I've read, this is every preacher's least favorite parable. And it's really an uncomfortable one to talk about. There's no easy answer. There's no clear teaching. And it really pushes us to go against everything our society wants us to value. And I can't wrap it up in a neat little package. But then that is most of our life as Christians. We can't wrap it up in a neat little package. We are called to struggle and to figure it out and to think about it and to consider with everything that we have, how can we use that to build up the kingdom, to build up the body of Christ, to build up the community that God calls us to be? How can we use all of our resources, what little we may have or what abundance we may have, in the interest of serving others, so that they might, in joyful reception of our service, turn around and serve somebody else? So you cannot, as I said, serve God and wealth, but you can use your wealth to serve God, and we as a congregation can use our wealth collectively to serve God. Next week, we are going to start talking about stewardship, although it seems we already have. And so I invite you to struggle with this parable this week, to struggle with this story, and to think of the ways in your lives in which we are being called to help others, and the ways in which others, maybe without us even really considering that's what they've done, have reduced our debts in some way. It's not an easy one, but it's the one we've been given to read and consider today. And in the end, there is good news.